Crime News claimed that in the United States, reports to the police for violence against women increased in 2020 due to the COVID-19 pandemic. A report by the Radiology Journal found that in a hospital in Boston, radiology scans consistent with wounds from domestic abuse from May 11th to March 3rd, 2020, exceeded the number of scans from May 11th to March 3rd, 2018, and in 2019 combined. Time attributes this increase in intimate partner violence due to higher stress levels during the pandemic as a result of financial and health concerns. According to Erica Sussman, the executive director of the Center for Survivor Advocacy and Justice, domestic violence rates are 50% higher for those with marginalized identities, including racial and sexual minorities and non-cisgender identities. Time magazine interviewed Sheila, a woman from Nebraska who reported being subjected to beatings during the pandemic by her spouse. Sheila says the lockdowns gave her partner an excuse to hold her at her home. Cassie Mecklenburg, executive director of Sheltering Wings, claims women do not have as many resources during the pandemic because hotlines are not as available and social distancing restrictions restrict their movement out of the home. Speaking from her own experience, project manager of Women's Empowerment and Recovery Educators, Jackie Mulveen, says victims of domestic abuse are constantly on high alert, worried about how their partner will react when in a mood. Mulveen also claims female victims become isolated from their friends and peers, especially during COVID times. Mecklenburg, an interviewee of The Times, claims leaving the abuser is difficult with women, returning to the relationship 7 times on average before leaving, which has become more difficult throughout the pandemic. According to the American Journal of Medicine, shelters for domestic abuse have been receiving an increased number of calls during lockdown. Bright Horizons is a shelter and advocacy group for domestic abuse survivors that originated in Nebraska. Bright Horizons helped Sheila find a refuge from her husband and connected her with law enforcement. Bright Horizons is dedicated to the elimination of all forms of violence against women through empowerment, education, and support. Sheltering Wings is a shelter and support group for victims of domestic abuse in Indiana. The executive director, Cassie Mecklenburg, states that it is hard for victims to reach out for help with their partners constantly home during lockdown. Those experiencing domestic abuse could reach out to an MTA Vision senior advisor who could connect them with resources for reporting instances of abuse, including available shelters and law enforcement. MTA Visions can work in an advocacy sense to provide victims with workshops for identifying situations of abuse and support groups to create an ecosystem of survivors in need of a safe space during the COVID-19 pandemic. MTA Visions can provide legal resources for victims who desire to take legal action. MTA Visions can also liaise with Women's Law to create an online hub listing free or low-cost legal services for victims. Support shelters for victims of domestic violence could reach out to MTA Vision senior advisor who could implement stakeholder engagement to increase their connectability to victims. MTA Visions can do this by enhancing civil society engagement and building a local network of organizations that facilitates the easy flow of information. MTA Visions could also work with banking stakeholders to increase funding for these shelters by providing expert opinion on the need for greater support of resources for domestic violence victims during COVID-19. Thank you for listening to this brief on the rise in gender-based violence in the United States during the COVID-19 pandemic, powered by MTA Visions. MTA Visions is a global corporate social responsibility and government relations firm based in Washington, D.C. that helps its clients move to champion profit with purpose, amplify impact both locally and globally, and protect clean interests in sovereign states and all levels of the U.S. government. To connect with a member of the MTA Visions team, send an email to info@mtavisions.com.